Hello, everyone. My name is Taylin Washington Harmon, and I am the Clinical Trials Editor here at blackdoctor.org. Today, we have a very special show regarding the recent FDA mandates that you may have heard about and what that actually means for Black people, especially Black women with breast cancer. So, I would like to introduce two of our distinguished guests. First is Ricky Fairley, the CEO of Touch BBCA, the Black Breast Cancer Alliance. So happy to have you here, Ricky.
So glad to be here with you. Thank you for doing.
Yes. And I would also like to introduce our other guest, Dr. Melissa Davis, and she is the first Georgia Research Alliance Distinguished Investigator at Morehouse School of Medicine, working with amazing clinical trials and how they affect Black folks. So happy to have you here, Dr. Davis.
Thank you. Thank you both so much. Glad to be here.
Yes, of course. So I guess to start our conversation, what exactly is this FDA Diversity Action Plan mandate, and what should the average person know about it? It sounds like it's really high level. So what should the average person know what this is, and what does it mean for them?
So I'll start, Taylor. And you know what? Let's take it back even a little bit. So basically what we're finding, and Dr. Melissa can speak to this so eloquently, is that the drugs aren't working for us in Black breast cancer. You know, Black women have a 41% higher mortality rate than white women, and we have a 39% higher recurrence rate than white women. And a lot of it has to do with the drugs aren't working for us because our bodies were never included in the clinical trials for the drugs that we currently have as standard of care. And so the only way we're going to change these horrible, devastating statistics is to get better drugs. And we also know that Black women participate in clinical trials at a 3% rate. So that's basically zero. I mean, so we're not participating in the trials that are happening even now. And so the FDA decided, and this actually started a couple of years ago, where they said, okay, how can we get pharmaceutical companies do a better job recruiting the patients we need to be in these trials for the drugs that they need, right? And make it more equitable and more fair. And so they kind of drafted a document, I guess, about 2 years ago, and then they kind of tried to make it formal in September. But basically, it's just requiring pharmaceutical companies to write a diversity plan. And so when they submit their drug to be approved by the FDA, they have to provide a plan of how they're going to actually reach the patients that need that drug.
Right.
So that's sort of the foundation of that. The problem starts, though, is because they've never been able to do it right. So I don't know what's going to be different about now, right? Because, and also when I challenged the FDA in the 2 years ago when they first brought the mandate out, I said, well, how are you going to even measure the success of it? What are your metrics? And nobody could answer that question for me. It was like, okay, Ricky, we're going to do better. Well, what does that mean? And so we're in this situation where the pharmaceutical companies don't really know how to do it. And so, you know, they're now challenged to do it, but they've never been able to do it successfully. So I don't know what's going to happen now other than calling people like me. And we are helping a bunch of companies do it, but still it's a huge ask. And it's a lot for them to even handle it successfully at this point.
Right. So how would you say that affects what you do, Dr. Davis?
Yeah, thank you. So, well, first of all, Ricky already did a great job of explaining, sort of the intention of the work that the FDA is beginning to track. And I think that says a lot, right? So up to this moment in time, that's not something that was ever considered diversity in the clinical trial. There was a time when sex as a biological variable became something that needed to be mandated in terms of meaning you had to have representation of men and women in your trials or in your research even. And that changed the game because typically women were not included in some of the trials or research related to things like lung cancer and other diseases. And so there was this aspect of, reproductive hormones and things like that weren't considered at that time. So now that they are at least going to start tracking diversity, I think that it'll help us understand to what degree treatments don't work. You know, for some women they do and they work well, but for a significant number of people from our background, our genetic background, we know that there are more adverse events. And if you think about it, meaning there are more side effects to some of the systemic chemotherapy and more long-term side effects as well. So not even just in making you sicker in the course of the treatment, but later on down the line, we see things like cardiotoxicity. So Black women having a higher likelihood of developing a heart disorder, cardiac dysfunction as a result of the treatment to cure her cancer. When we think about those different phases of clinical trials, right? The first phase is very small. It's like tens of people. That phase of the clinical trial is actually designed to determine toxicity. It's designed to understand safety and dosage. You know, how much should you give a patient? But I just mentioned that in our population, we see a higher incident of adverse events. So that means the dosage and the safety isn't the same across the board. But because there's such a small number and there's no diversity, we completely miss that toxicity because we haven't included people in phase one, right? We haven't included our ethnic group, our representative diversity in phase one. And so now I think what we'll start to do is point out the fact that there are predispositions or susceptibilities that we already know in a certain field called pharmacogenetics, right? Where we match a gene to a drug, right? So we understand that people who have a certain version of a gene that is supposed to help just your body break down the drug into the components that are useful, that doesn't always work the same in various people. We know that, some people are Tylenol intolerant, for instance, right? So that's true of every synthetic drug. There's going to be people who are more or less tolerant. And so we don't really fully understand the spectrum of that safety and dosage because we haven't had that diversity in clinical trials. So for me, I think it's going to affect my work by allowing us to identify, what are some of the genetic underpinnings that define a population's sort of tolerance, if you will, to what becomes the standard of care. Like maybe it shouldn't just be the general standard. Maybe it needs to be modified to account for sensitivities that are, across the population.
Right. So, Dr. Davis, I do want you to touch a little bit more on, what your role is as a researcher and working for the Institute of Translational Genomic Medicine. So tell us.
She started it. That's her. That's her.
Yes. So tell us a little bit more about what you do.
Thank you. So I'm a genomicist, and all that means is I'm a geneticist. So I look at genes. I study them in humans now. My training was actually in model organisms, so I used different other animals when I got my PhD at UGA, go Dogs. And now I am the inaugural director of an institute at Morehouse School of Medicine for translational genomic medicine. Translational being the operative word, meaning we take genomics research and create applications that are relevant to our undersupported populations, borrowing a word from Ricky. She's teaching me how to be more clear about, how we express ourselves here. And so my job is to create a resource for Morehouse School of Medicine and other historically Black colleges to be able to do genomics research, hopefully in the genomic medicine space, meaning we want to dig more deeply into what I just described, ancestry, genetic background, related opportunities for therapeutics, but also very much so protecting our populations from harm wherever possible, right? To understand that we can look at all the genes simultaneously, which is why we call it genomics instead of just genetics. We look at the genome, which is the full compendium of all of your genes. And we ask questions about where they are expressed in your body, when they get turned on, when they get turned off, why, what is it in the environment that cues certain genes to become dysregulated, meaning they're no longer operating in the time and space that they should. And yeah, so my cancer background, my cancer research is related to the fact that we see biological variations across the diverse population. And some of that is because of our genetic background, and more pointedly, our African ancestry. We have inherited versions of genes that were advantageous in Africa, yet in this environment become a point of susceptibility, a point of sensitivity that has not been fully appreciated, let's say, in medical research in general. But my group focuses on breast cancer primarily.
Mm. And your work is so important because, I mean, breast cancer drugs simply do not affect Black women the same way that they affect white women.
Right.
Ricky and I have had this conversation a lot. So
Yeah.
delving into the genes of it is so key. And I especially wanted to bring up why the diversity action plan just mandate is what it's missing is because they're primarily asking for this diversity at phase 3 of clinical trials.
Right.
And that is simply much too late. And Ricky, you do a great job of explaining why that is. So let's talk about that.
Right. Now my dog and my granddog are in my face. The kids, but so Melissa just explained it. What phase 1 is all about, and basically, there are really, I guess, kind of 4 phases of clinical trial, of clinical trial development or of a clinical trial. And so phase 1 is so critical, and it may only have about 10 people in it, but still, if you think about triple negative breast cancer, if Black women get it at 3 times the rate of white women, those numbers need to be reflected in that 10. I'm not smart enough to do that math, Melissa is, but how many women should be in that, out of that 10 should be Black women, right? And that's where they're looking at safety and dosage and all these important things with the drug. And then in phase 2, maybe phase 2 may have 50 people, maybe even 100, and they're still testing the dosage, the efficacy, and all the factors that could make the drug act differently in Black bodies. And so these plans are really for phase 3. And phase 3 trial, they're now going to thousands of people, and they still haven't tested the drug on Black bodies. And so basically by phase 3, we're in the birth canal for that drug. It's cooked. It's done. It's a done deal. And they're not going to do any major changes to the formulation at that point. And so it's almost like a moot point to do these, this diversity plan for phase 3. I mean, thank you, FDA, for at least, showing some degree of understanding here, but still, it's really too late to make a real valuable difference in how the drug is going to perform in our bodies. And, it's like, I don't know who was thinking about this when they made this rule up, but it's like, what were you thinking? Like, to me, we have to do it early in the very beginning of the drug development to really make a difference, that make it work on our bodies. And I mean, I don't know, Melissa, I was talking to, I did a show on my Doctors In show a couple of weeks ago for prostate cancer with Dr. Keith and Clayton. And they were telling me about Clayton Yates, one of our soundbite partners at Johns Hopkins. And they were telling me about how immunotherapy has never been deemed as a good drug for prostate cancer. But guess why? Because they tested it on white men. And so, but they never tested it on Black men. So on white men, immunotherapy is not working for prostate cancer. So they kind of rule it out. But they've just recently found out that, guess what? It does work on Black men. Now, these kinds of drugs have been around now for 7 or 8 years. They started out with lung cancer, and they've done really, great things for people. Even we now have one for triple negative, 2 for triple negative. But just think about that. They ruled it out for a whole cancer type that could have saved Black men's lives for all this time. And so there's an example of where they didn't test the drug on bodies that need it, that could be different. And so, there's so many times where, I think we're just missing the boat on saving people, saving lives. And so to start this at phase 3 is just too late.
Right. What are your thoughts on that, Dr. Davis?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think as I speak to different people who, I don't know if they wrote the guidelines, but they certainly work for, the FDA, or they're a part of sort of the think tank around how to implement this call to action to be more diverse. They'll say, well, we have to start somewhere. And I think that, yeah, that's true. We have to start somewhere. So, I don't want to necessarily say that it's a useless endeavor, but we have to somehow make sure that we stress the importance of including these underrepresented populations, as Ricky said, across the spectrum. Like it should be a requirement at every phase because of what you just mentioned. By the time you get to phase 3, which is specifically about therapeutic efficacy compared to standard of care, more explicitly, it's at that phase that they think, well, now we want to include the diversity because we want to be able to catch these things that have been obviously missed, as Ricky was speaking about, right? So the fact that there was sort of this foregone conclusion that prostate cancer patients were not going to benefit from a whole category of therapies because they were only looking at a singular population. If they had included diverse populations in that phase 3, then they would have seen that African American men had a better response, right? So that's what they're looking for right now. But we have to draw their attention now back to, well, you can also limit some of the harm that's being done from standard of care.
Right.
If before it becomes the standard, we have a better understanding of the toxicity in this population. And so I guess, we start with our wins and then we expand from there. And, I think our project, SAMBI, is going to help a lot with that, because what we'll be able to do with Ricky's help is explain to them exactly how they can start to reach these populations, right? Like we often hear from any government or large institution, entity, that certain populations are, quote, hard to reach either by virtue of them having a lack of hearing the message, and that could be due to a barrier where they just don't ever receive it, or it could be a barrier where they don't believe it, right? Or the fact that they physically are out of reach because of, transportation issues or isolation in some rural area, or even in, in an urban city where they just don't have the access to be included in a clinical trial. Like literally the clinics that they are allowed, to enter into for treatment based on their healthcare access are not a part of any clinical trials, right? So the problem is multifaceted, but there are also multiple solutions, right? Like it's not just about the community being more receptive. It's also about the institutions being more imaginative, inclusive, relaxing some of the guidelines that they currently have. I mean, another issue is the fact that when clinical trials are designed, they're designed to have the least amount of variation as possible because they don't want any unexplainable results. And so that oftentimes creates these guardrails of other health aspects, right? You have to be a certain weight, you have to be a certain age, you have to have never had a whole list of other diseases. And when you're talking about this particular underprioritized, marginalized population, we have an inundated, a larger, if you will, burden of all of those things, obesity, diabetes,
high blood pressure,
exactly. Exactly. And so if we can't overcome the systemic issues that drive those comorbidities before we are in need of a clinical trial, we may still not be able to make it into phase 3 because there's still going to be those limitations, those sort of eligibility criteria as well. But all of that needs to be considered in the general population. I mean, we're not just trying to treat this one subset of patients. We're trying to treat a general population. And it's just amazing to me how you streamline the test subjects so strictly and then expect that now generalizing the application should just be seamless and it just should work. But that's why a lot of drugs fail, at phase 3, right? Like they don't see the effect that they thought they would see. And it's like, well, I wonder why.
Yeah, you should have known. And when people, because when they bring it to the population that does have diabetes or hypertension or all these other things, it doesn't work effectively. And they would have known that had they put Black women in phase 1, So
yeah, and we're already saying that all of those things help cause cancer,
Right,
so we're
exactly.
talking about the majority of the population is going to have those factors to deal with. So
yeah,
yeah,
they're causing the cancer.
And I mean, one of the biggest barriers about clinical trials is the fact that Black folks simply just aren't even being asked.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
I was going to say the same thing, Taylor, that doctors are not inviting us. That's like the number one reason why we're not participating. And, that's why we try to educate women. I can't change racism. I can't change the mindset of a 50-year-old white oncologist that's not talking to my patients. But what I can do is educate Black women. And that's where, we try to do that with our When We Trial program. But it's really horrible. The other big factor, and it's still a huge factor too for as a barrier, is that Black people don't understand what a clinical trial is. And why would you? Why would you understand it? It's this fear of the unknown that I think I'm going to get a sugar pill and die. But no one, if your doctor didn't explain it to you, how would you know? How would you know what it is? And so we spend a lot of time just explaining stuff like easy stuff, like, the Advil you took last week, it was in a clinical trial. The heart medicine I feed my dogs, right? They're sitting next to me. It was in a clinical trial. And so when you break it down and explain the science in words people can spell, and really from the voice of a cancer patient, because it's a voice of trust, people get it. Like, I want to sign up. I don't want to die. I want to try this new drug, because you're probably getting a drug that you may not even see on the market for 5 years, but it's the best science we have.
Exactly. I also wanted to mention, given all of this new information and the fact that, they're asking for this diversity only at phase 3. I know that the deadline for public comment on basically the mandate passed already. It's September 26th. It was September 26th.
Yes.
And, all of these questions being brought, who knows if they've been, been placed in the public comment area. So what do you think can be done now going forward, now that we know this information, knowing that the diversity is only asked for by phase 3? What can we do to make sure that Black folks are included earlier, and these major pharma companies aren't waiting until the last minute to add us in and say, like, oh, well, we need this, so what can we do early on?
You want to go? Go ahead.
I think Ricky already does a great job. She goes directly to pharma and, she tells them, y'all are doing this wrong. I think we need to speak directly.
Every day.
We need to speak directly to them. I mean, a guideline is a guideline. And as we see the implications of using more diverse and inclusive populations, shifting less toxicity, and we start reporting that, I think it'll be really powerful. But it'll have to begin with a partnership, with pharma to say, we know the guidelines say you don't have to do it until phase 3, but what if you actually did it earlier? And here is a toolkit of how you can actually educate and reach these populations right now in phase 1. You don't have to wait.
Yep. And that's what we're doing, Taylor. I mean, you know what? I'm so grateful for our pharma partners, because I really do feel like they've embraced me, even when I tell them their babies are ugly all the time. but I feel like they've given me a seat at the table, and they're listening, and they're inviting us to participate in the design of the trials. And so we're doing a lot of that work right now. I mean, we have a trial that we started with Genentech 2 years ago called Avera. It's a drug for hormone receptor breast cancer, and we actually helped them change everything about their marketing and how they were talking about the trial. We recreated their website. We made it so that it would embrace black women would be embraced by it. And when they started, they had 2% representation of Black women in this trial, and we just closed the recruiting a month ago, and we had 12%. And so 12% is good. I'm proud of that, but it's still not good enough. You know what I mean? Like, it should be way bigger than that. But at least we're starting with something, and they heard me. And I think a lot of it had to do with not only how we talk about the trial and the creative that we use to describe it and the messaging, but also we have this great nurse navigator program, and our nurse navigators are Black women who are breast cancer survivors, so they can speak from lived experience, and we have it 24/7. So when the cancer center closes at 5:00, we can be there. Val can be there, and our team can be there to talk to them and talk them off the ledge and explain the informed consent to their families and help them not only to get recruited for the trials, but to stay with the trials. And so we're doing more and more and more of that. Now it's so funny because we did a thing for October with a couple of pharma companies just to test it across all of our clinical trials and just all treatment. And the pharma companies that didn't participate with us are getting in trouble because we're getting a lot of press about it, because their bosses are, well, why aren't you guys doing this with Touch? So hopefully we'll get to do more of it. But we're finding that just having a navigator talk somebody off the ledge at 2 a.m. is a great tool. And we get so many calls really after dinner where the woman comes home from treatment. They sit at the dinner table, the husband or the mom or the auntie have a million questions that she can't answer, and they call us. And we can talk to them at 8 or 9 o'clock at night and explain what's going on. And I think that pharma is really starting to see the value in that. So we hopefully they'll embrace it even more. But I think, they all want to do the right thing. They really do. They just don't really know how. So, but now they're opening it up to advocacy to help design how we talk to people about it. And we've sort of cracked the nut on it. I mean, our When We Trial campaign, now we've got 20,069 Black women have signed up for portals in the last 2 years. So, we understand the language to use, so it's working. Thank you, God.
Yeah, amazing. I mean, like I said, I'm hopeful because they at least now understand that diversity is important. I mean, 5-10 years ago, the conversation kind of went like it didn't matter if you were Black or white. Cancer is cancer. It doesn't matter. We don't have to study, different people, different groups. We can just study these convenient cohorts that walk in the door here, and that's good enough, But now at least there is a real awareness, and I think we can build on that. So
yeah, but also it's also because of researchers like Dr. Melissa that now we have more Black people doing the research. And so like, we don't have enough Black doctors, we don't have enough Black researchers, but the way when we can fill these shoes and do these jobs that have never been done before, Melissa is the first Black woman to win a Cancer Grand Challenge.
That's
first.
amazing.
And so it's a huge thing. But I mean, for her to be able to do this work and make the changes that we need is a major deal. And we're so happy to be a part of it with her. But, she's the first.
I'm a vessel. I have a great team. I can't take much credit, but thank you for joining me.
Yeah.
Dr. Davis, tell us a little bit more about your program. I believe it's called the SAMBA program. Tell us what exactly that is and what you do with it.
Yeah, thank you. SAMBA is an acronym, and it stands for Societal
Ancestry. Right.
Thank you. Societal Ancestry and Molecular Biology Analyses of Inequities. And it's an international team. So we are spanning across 3 different continents, and it includes the US, the UK, and 5 countries in Africa. And we focus on the multifaceted issues that drive global cancer inequities by virtue of 5 separate teams. Each team has sort of a specialty. The first team is focused on social and societal determinants, or societal trauma is what we're calling it. So focusing on discrimination at whatever level and stage and flavor someone's lived experience may involve a discrimination. So it doesn't have to be racism across the board, because in Africa, it may not be racism as we know it in the US, right? Exposures is team 2. We call it exposomics, meaning all of the exposures someone has. So we are quantifying biomarkers that are relevant to anything, your environment, what you're exposed to as far as pollution, your cosmetic use, your alcohol, smoking, whatever, everything, as Dr. Miller would say, who's leading that work package. Dr. Laura McCullough and Tiffany Carson are 2 phenomenal Black women who are also leading work package 1. Our third team is on genomics and epigenomics, and we have a team from the New York Genome Center, NYU, and Weill Cornell. Also being co-led by one of my mentees, Nyasha Shambwe, another powerful Black woman who is really going to reset the way we do genomics analyses in this population. So we'll be creating what we call an African-specific reference for the populations that we study. Instead of comparing our DNA to the typical human genome reference or a white population, for instance, will be more focused on comparing our DNA back to an African genome, for instance. And then the last data-driven team is tumor immunology, so looking at the immunological response in tumors. And that's co-led by Dr. Clayton Yates and many of our colleagues at the UK, Sheba Rashad, Nigel Mongan, and Fika Froling. And then our patient involvement work package. We don't call it patient engagement. So Cancer Grand Challenge requires that we have patient engagement, but I wanted our patients to be involved. And so they will be seated at the table with every one of our scientific teams and helping us to rethink the way not only we approach generating the data, but certainly the way we interpret those findings and then disseminate them to the general population. The goal is to create a new comprehensive data resource that has all of those different elements of the data on the same group of patients. One of the biggest limitations in cancer inequities research is the fact that you don't have all of the pieces to the puzzle for the same set of patients, right? We have a lot of information about social determinants and no genetics, or a ton of genetics and very little societal information. And all of that together is what's necessary to understand the interaction of living in an environment with a certain genetic background, with the social or societal barriers that one has to deal with in terms of even just being healthy in general, but certainly surviving a cancer diagnosis. So we hope to recruit over 40,000 participants over the next 5 to 6 years across these different countries. And yeah, every year we're going to push out all of our findings. So hopefully along the way, we'll make a lot of leaps in our understanding and our knowledge base.
No, that's amazing. I definitely want to stay in the loop of everything that you're doing with Sambai.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
we talked a lot about, genetics, how our unique African Black genetics affect cancer diagnoses, what the FDA mandate is kind of getting wrong about how it's considering Black patients. So what should the average person that's watching this right now, what should they take from our conversation, Ricky and Dr. Davis?
I tell everybody, just challenge your doctors, and you are the CEO of your own health. And, we all, when you get that diagnosis of cancer, it's like you're in the dark. All of a sudden, all the lights go off and you're scared to death. And everything you hear is wah, wah, wah. You can't even hear what the doctors are saying to you. And you're flooded with information that you may not understand. But I always challenge doctors, okay, well, I want the golden rule treatment. I want you to treat me like you would treat somebody that you love or somebody in your family. So what does that look like for me? You know what I mean? Would you recommend this treatment plan to your mama, your auntie, your grandma, your daughter? Because if it's not good enough for them, it's not good enough for me. And challenge it, and even challenge the treatment plans and say, well, how many Black patients did well with this treatment plan? How many Black patients did well with a lumpectomy? And just never take no for an answer. No is never the answer. It's always how. But don't just take
Mm.
things for granted. Like ask the doctors and challenge them, and we'll help you. Call me. I've been thrown out of many doctors' offices, even on Zoom, even on Zoom and FaceTime. Who is that woman? But I don't really care, because we have to challenge. You can't just take it for granted. You have to advocate for yourself, because there is not always a right answer with cancer, and with diseases like triple negative breast cancer, you need to do all the things. You need to do all the things, and maybe a lumpectomy isn't what you should do because the recurrence rate is so high. So I would just say, just be in control as much as you can. And if you don't know, we're here for you. That's what we do all day. Call us. We have plenty of resources, and we're about to launch actually a really comprehensive website for Black women and triple negative breast cancer. Gilead funded this website. It's really going to be a hub for Black women. We're going to launch it as soon as Kamala gets elected. We're going to put the press out there, but we're waiting for her. But we want everyone to feel welcome, and we've flooded it with information. We've flooded it with stories. If you go on the website, you will not see a stock picture. You'll see all women who are struggling with this disease talking about what they need and what you need as a patient. So use our resources. We have a lot of information on One Week 12, but it's really just arming yourself, and be careful about Dr. Google. Come to places that are the sources that you can trust, and we have them. We work really hard to make sure that we are giving the best information, because I will call Melissa anytime up there and ask her a question and say, can you help me understand this in words I can spell, right?
Yeah.
So we try to translate the information. So it is, but be in control. You're the CEO. You'll take those shoes back if they don't fit. You'll go take that nail polish off if you don't like the color, right? So same thing with the doctor. You're paying them, or someone's paying them to give you a service. So if you don't feel like you know in your gut whether you're getting good care or not. We had a breastie. She's now passed, but she used to always say, "I want the Ruth Chris doctor's appointment today, not the McDonald's drive-through. Like, I want all the things, right? And ask for the care that you deserve. Like, take your hand off that doorknob, because I'm not done yet, and we'll help you, get ready for those appointments and have the right questions to ask, so you can get the best care."
Exactly.
Yeah. Right.
Any thoughts,
And,
Dr. Davis, on what we should take from this conversation?
well, I just want to point out that, what you're witnessing right now in the space that we are existing in is a holistic understanding of cancer inequities. For the first time, we see this convergence of all of these different disciplines working together
Yeah.
at a scale that we've never done before. And our goal is to provide the evidence that is needed to inform policy changes, such as the FDA guidelines, and to foster global partnerships, because it's not just about what we see here in the United States, but globally, this shared genetic similarity and genetic background is the underlying reason we see these inequities broadly across the world. And so as we aim to provide that evidence, we believe that our work will be the catalyst for meaningful change, but we need participation. We need you to work with us. We need to hear your voice. We need you to participate in the research. We need you to read the papers. We're gonna make a patient version of every scientific paper that we publish, and we need to hear back from you. What do you think about the work that we're doing, and how can we create a new standard for this research, so that we're no longer on the fringes of it, but are centralized and focused as a high priority, within it. And if we can partner and create any resource that helps you advocate for yourself or even just understand, conversations that you have, I think that would be great. We would love to create that.
Right. The onus really is on healthcare providers and researchers to make this information, accessible to the average person, because doctors understand it, people who have gone to school for this understand it. But what about, just a normal woman, single mother of two, who's just been diagnosed with breast cancer
Yeah.
and has no clue what's next for her?
Yeah.
So
And pharma has a you know what, really, I think everybody in the ecosystem has some responsibility for these devastating mortality numbers, and everybody's got to take whatever they have, whatever piece of this work they can do to change it. It's not,
Right.
it's just not right. It's just not
It's
right.
gotta be
Done.
it's gotta be about more than their bottom line.
It does.
You know.
It's got to be, yes.
Yeah.
It's got to be about caring, and I do think people care. I think it's just a new area, as you said, Melissa, that they just don't know what to do. So,
Yeah.
ask me, I'll give you my opinion anytime about what to do. I mean, I'm a marketing person, so I think about, okay, how can we change the words, the pictures, the whatever, to get somebody to change their behavior? And
Right.
people are doing it every day. So it's the same thing about with pharma. Like, how can you think about it differently? So.
right.
But we have to think about it differently. The old way of doing things, or the status quo, is just not working.
Right.
Absolutely.
Well, I want to thank you both so much for coming on the show today. This was a really insightful conversation. I really hope everyone watching is left with some sort of great knowledge about what they can take either for themselves or for their loved one, or even if they work in this field, what they can do next. So I want to thank you both, and you have a lovely day.
Thank you so much for doing this. Yeah.
All right.
Take
Bye.
care. Love you, Melissa. Bye.
Thanks. Love you too.
Take care. Thank you.